I am Rachel, a 45-year-old woman who has spent nearly 2 decades deeply connected to my marriage and cherishing the joy of being a mother to my 10-year-old son, Dylan. Our small family has just arrived in Saranac Lake, a tranquil town nestled within the majestic Adirondack Mountains in New York State. This place feels like a completely different world, where the hustle and bustle of larger cities like Albany or Syracuse now seem like distant memories. Eric, my husband, is a dedicated and talented civil engineer. His work is inseparable from construction sites, often requiring him to move from one location to another. We had grown accustomed to a life of constant relocation, but the distance and separation gradually left me feeling hollow. So when Eric suggested moving to this town, a place only a 20-minute drive from his worksite, I didn't hesitate. The decision not only saved him commuting time but also gave Dylan and me the chance to be closer to him, building a warmer and more stable family life together. Saranac Lake welcomed us with its crisp, fresh air and an indescribable sense of serenity. Narrow roads surrounded by lush green forests and sparkling lakes reflecting the sunlight seemed to invite us into a new life, one where time slowed down so we could savor every moment together. Yet, amidst this picture-perfect scenery, I carried with me unnamed thoughts, like a floating cloud lingering over an otherwise flawless sky. Saranac Lake appeared like a serene painting, with quaint wooden houses tucked around tranquil lakes mirroring the bright blue sky. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. Yet, during those first days in the new town, I couldn't ignore the feelings of isolation and loneliness. Eric was busy with work all day, and Dylan was immersed in his school life. I often found myself alone at home, trying to adjust to the slow pace and the peculiar quietness of this town. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I spent hours staring out the window, watching leaves gently sway in the breeze, or strolling along the narrow gravel roads where everything felt as though it was in a deep slumber. Saranac Lake was undeniably beautiful, but its tranquility left me feeling more lonely than at peace. I love Eric, there's no doubt about that. But after all these years, our love no longer burns as passionately as it once did. His work, the blueprints, the construction sites awaiting completion, consumed nearly all his time and energy. On the evenings he came home late, exhausted, he barely had the strength to quietly eat dinner before slipping into sleep. The compliments and tender gestures that once made me feel like the most special woman in the world seemed to belong to a distant past. I miss the days when he would look at me and say, "You're so beautiful," or the evenings when he would spend hours talking with me, his eyes brimming with affection. Now, all of that felt swept away by endless projects and meetings. Saranac Lake might be the ideal place to start over, but my heart wasn't so quick to follow. It was still busy wondering whether Eric and I could rediscover the emotions that once sparkled as vividly as the sunset on a windless lake. That afternoon, I was struggling with a jammed door lock. Dylan had just run into the yard, cheerfully playing with a small ball, while I wrestled with the stubborn key that seemed determined to defy my every effort. Sweat began to form on my forehead, and I silently scolded myself, why haven't I called a locksmith yet? "Need some help?" a warm, deep voice called out from behind me. I turned around to see our neighbor, Jack. Standing there was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with slightly disheveled hair. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, exuding a mix of enthusiasm and a touch of shyness. "Oh, hello," I said, a bit flustered. "This lock is acting up, and I have no idea what to do with it." Jack stepped closer, smiling. "Let me take a look. I've dealt with a few stubborn locks like this before." He nodded and gestured for the key. I stepped aside, giving him space. Dylan, intrigued, paused his game to watch. Jack knelt down, expertly twisting the key with practiced ease. After a few tries, the lock emitted a soft click and opened. "There you go," Jack said, a proud smile spreading across his face. "Thank you so much." I exhaled, genuinely grateful. I thought I'd have to call a locksmith. "No problem. But you should probably replace this lock soon," he advised. "I've got a toolkit at home. If you'd like, I can help you change it tomorrow." Dylan ran up at that moment, grinning. "You're amazing. Mom couldn't do it at all." Jack chuckled, ruffling Dylan's hair. Sometimes locks just need a little persuasion. I looked at him, a wave of relief washing over me. I really appreciate it, Jack. I'm Rachel, and this is my son, Dylan. It's great to meet you. Nice to meet you and Dylan, he replied, his gaze sincere. If you ever need anything, just call me. I'm right next door. We exchanged goodbyes, and I watched as Jack headed back to his house. Perhaps life in Saranac Lake wasn't as bad as I had imagined. After all, having a helpful neighbor like him made this place feel a little more welcoming. The encounter with Jack quickly faded into the background of my early days adjusting to the new town. He was a polite and thoughtful neighbor, and there was no denying that. But aside from his help with the lock and a few polite exchanges, I didn't think much more of it. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of him trimming the hedge or checking his old pickup truck as I passed by the yard or glanced out the kitchen window. In those moments, I would offer a faint smile, a silent nod of gratitude for his earlier kindness. We didn't speak much, nor did we have any real reason to. Yet, in a few quiet moments, I found myself appreciating his presence, not for any specific reason, but simply because his friendliness eased the sense of unfamiliarity I felt in this new town. Maybe it was just a natural response to finding a familiar face amidst the strangeness. And so, Jack became a small part of the canvas of my new life. Not a significant piece, but enough to make the world around me feel a little less foreign. As time passed, life in the small town became more familiar. Jack, my friendly neighbor, and I began seeing each other more often. Simple greetings turned into long conversations. I learned more about him, a once successful businessman who faced the bitter sting of failure when his company went bankrupt. Jack had moved to this town to start over, living in his mother's old house, a place filled with childhood memories. That morning, Dylan had boarded the school bus early, leaving the house enveloped in its usual quiet. I took the opportunity to run some errands at the grocery store. When I stepped out, the sky was still a brilliant blue, with gentle sunlight filtering through the roadside trees. But the weather in Saranac Lake was always unpredictable. Within minutes, the sky darkened, and cold winds rustled the leaves. A distant rumble of thunder signaled the arrival of a heavy storm. Before I could find shelter, large raindrops began to fall, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour. I hurried home, clutching my grocery bags tightly against my chest to protect them from the rain. The icy water pelted my face, and each step became a challenge as my wet shoes slipped on the slick road. My thin jacket offered no defense against the storm, and within minutes, the water had soaked through, clinging coldly to my skin. When I reached my front door, I was gasping for breath, rummaging through my bag for the keys. But as I tried to fit the key into the lock, the stubborn door refused to budge. The old lock, which I had been meaning to replace, had jammed again. The rain continued relentlessly, cold droplets streaming from my hair down to my shoulders, soaking my collar. I struggled with the lock, my hands trembling not just from the chill, but also from mounting frustration. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, feeling tears of helplessness welling up. Water trickled down my dress and dripped onto my legs. The soaked fabric clung to my body, making me even more uncomfortable. Bending over, I gave the lock another forceful twist, but it was useless. The cold crept deeper into my skin, making me shiver as my hands shook harder. "Please, just open," I whispered like a desperate prayer, but the door remained immovable. Jack appeared from next door, his voice cutting through the rain. "Ms. Rachel. Are you all right?" I turned to him, attempting a helpless smile while rainwater dripped from my hair onto my face. "The lock is stuck again, and I forgot to replace it," I explained awkwardly, my voice quivering from the cold. Jack quickly crossed the yard, braving the rain to reach me. "Let me take a look," he said, taking the keys from my hands. He tried turning the lock several times, frowning when it refused to budge. "Looks like you'll need a locksmith," he said apologetically, placing the keys back in my hand. A gust of wind swept through, making me shiver visibly. My wet dress clung tightly to my skin, the cold biting deep. Jack seemed to notice, glancing away awkwardly but with clear concern in his expression. "If you don't mind," he hesitated, scratching the back of his neck, "you could wait out the storm at my place. It doesn't look like it'll stop anytime soon, and you really should change before you catch a cold." I hesitated, looking out at the relentless rain. His suggestion made sense, but the idea of stepping into a single man's house left me feeling uneasy. "I don't want to bother you," I said softly, intertwining my fingers nervously to hide my embarrassment. "It's no bother at all," Jack said with a faint smile, though a hint of awkwardness lingered on his face. "If you'd prefer, I can at least grab a coat from inside to help keep you warm for now." The biting cold forced me to reconsider. Finally, I gave a small nod, my voice escaping in a sigh. "All right, thank you." Jack led me to his house. It was only a few steps across the yard, but the storm seemed to sap the last remnants of my energy. As we stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped me, but the lingering feeling of unease remained. Jack's home was a modest apartment, unmistakably that of a bachelor living alone. Stepping inside, I was immediately struck by the characteristic clutter, newspapers and magazines piled on the small dining table, a few unwashed dishes stacked in the sink, and the couch adorned with cushions scattered in disarray. Jack seemed slightly flustered, offering a sheepish smile as he said, "Sorry, Ms. Rachel. I wasn't expecting company today. The place is a bit messy." I smiled back, sensing the sincerity in his apology. "It's fine," I replied, making an effort not to focus too much on the untidiness. Jack gestured toward the end of the hallway. "The bathroom's down there. I'll grab some towels and tidy up a bit before you go in." I nodded and followed his direction. The bathroom, too, was far from pristine. Toothbrushes and toothpaste were scattered across the sink, a razor lay carelessly beside them, and the mirror had a faint layer of fog. But what made me freeze in my tracks was the sight of a condom lying conspicuously on the floor, half tucked under the edge of the sink. My cheeks flushed as I stood there, unsure of what to do. After a moment, I stepped back out, trying to keep my voice steady, though the embarrassment was evident. "Jack, could you tidy up a little more, please?" Jack approached, following my gaze, and immediately understood. His face turned crimson as he quickly picked up the offending item. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize," he stammered, his tone filled with genuine regret. I could do nothing but stand there, the air thick with awkwardness. "It's all right," I said softly, attempting to dispel the discomfort. Jack hurriedly cleaned up, putting things in better order. "It's all set now," he said, opening the bathroom door with an apologetic smile. I stepped inside, feeling slightly more at ease now that the mess had been addressed. Still, the earlier incident left me feeling a bit uneasy. I quickly showered and changed into a nightgown I had just bought. Originally, I had intended to wear it for Eric, but the unexpected situation left me with no choice but to use it now. When I emerged, my hair was still damp, water dripping down onto the light, thin fabric of the gown, which clung closely to my body. Jack was standing in the living room, and his eyes unintentionally glanced at me before he quickly looked away. "You look beautiful," Jack blurted out, his voice hesitant, and his face flushed a deep red. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have stared." I chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "It's all right," I replied. Then, feeling an odd impulse, I added with a teasing tone, "Do you think my husband is lucky?" Jack stood frozen for a moment, his face reddening further. "Very, very lucky," he said, his voice genuine yet halting. His words made me laugh, and for the first time in days, I felt a bit more at ease. But the laughter quickly gave way to an awkward silence that hung between us, leaving me uncertain if I should say anything more. As the awkward silence between Jack and me lingered, the sound of the doorbell suddenly shattered the tension. The locksmith had arrived. I breathed a sigh of relief, as though I had just escaped a tricky situation. Jack quickly went to answer the door, then turned back to me with a slightly uneasy smile. "I'll let them handle it." Ms. Rachel, if you need anything else, just let me know. Thank you, Jack, I replied, doing my best to sound as natural as possible. I won't bother you anymore. I left his house, feeling a mix of relief and something else I couldn't quite name. As I passed him, I noticed Jack still standing at the door, his eyes lingering with a hesitant yet thoughtful expression, though he said nothing more. Back at my own home, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it with a long exhale. A small smile crept onto my lips, like I'd just teased a boy and left him unsure of what to say. It wasn't a strong, overwhelming sensation, just a quiet, simple joy that felt oddly comforting. From that day on, things seemed to subtly shift. Whenever I bumped into Jack outside, he would always greet me with the same question, "How's your day been?" His eyes shone brightly, sincere but tinged with a hint of awkwardness. We began talking more, not just casual greetings, but real conversations. I learned more about Jack. He had once been a successful businessman, but the collapse of his business led to the breakdown of his marriage. His wife couldn't handle the loneliness, and Jack felt powerless as his life unraveled. He returned to this town to seek solace, living in his mother's old house as he tried to rebuild his sense of peace. Jack's story struck a chord with me. In turn, I shared with him stories about Eric, my husband who was always busy with work, and the growing void in our marriage. I wasn't complaining, just speaking candidly about feelings I rarely voiced. Over time, I realized that my conversations with Jack had become a regular part of my day. He listened, he understood, and he never seemed in a hurry to cut me off. But at the same time, I became aware of something else. Jack's presence wasn't just comforting. There was something more, something small but enough to unsettle me. My heart would beat a little faster when I saw him, and occasionally, I found myself wondering if these feelings were something I shouldn't entertain. I tried to keep my distance from Jack. After all, I was a wife, a mother, and I didn't want any misunderstandings to arise. Yet, his presence had quietly woven itself into the fabric of my daily life. Whenever I stepped outside, I often felt Jack's gaze from his window, or we'd cross paths at the door, exchanging polite greetings. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, I was trimming the stubborn rose bushes in my front yard. The thorns demanded all my attention, and sweat dotted my forehead. Suddenly, a deep, familiar voice spoke from behind me. "Ms. Rachel, need some help?" I turned to find Jack standing there, leaning on a cane, his right leg lightly bandaged, evidence of an injury I hadn't known about. His face looked slightly tired, but his warm smile was as kind as ever. "Jack! What happened to you?" I asked, my eyes fixed with concern on his injured leg. "Oh, it's nothing serious," he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just a little accident at work." "I'm so sorry to hear that." "You should be resting, not walking around," I said, shaking my head. Jack chuckled lightly, his eyes reflecting his resilience. "I feel fine. But if you don't mind, I could help you water the plants. It's not too strenuous." I looked at him, sensing the genuine offer in his words. Still, a part of me hesitated. "You really don't have to. I can handle it just fine." "Honestly, I'd like to help," Jack said warmly. "It's boring being home alone." I paused before finally nodding. "All right, if you insist, but be careful with your leg." "I promise," he said with a bright smile. I handed him the watering can, and together we worked on the small garden. Watching Jack awkwardly hold the can with one hand while relying on his cane with the other, I couldn't help but feel a mix of sympathy and closeness. He struggled to reach the taller plants, their height proving to be a challenge for him. "Let me help you," I said, stepping closer. Together, we lifted the can higher, standing side by side. In that moment, I felt his warmth, and my heart skipped a beat. "Your garden is beautiful," Jack murmured, his eyes fixed on the flowers glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. "Thank you. I've always loved gardening, it helps me relax," I replied, striving to keep my voice steady. "That's wonderful. I wish I had a garden like this, he said, his tone tinged with wistfulness. You can start one anytime, I encouraged him. I'd be happy to help you pick out plants and get started. Jack looked at me with gratitude in his eyes. You're so kind, Rachel. I really appreciate that. We continued working quietly, accompanied only by the gentle sound of water and the rustling leaves in the breeze. The sun had fully set by the time we were done, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. When we finished, Jack set the watering can down and turned to me. Thank you for letting me help, he said sincerely. I should be the one thanking you, I replied with a smile. You made my evening so much more enjoyable. Jack laughed softly, and for a moment, I felt a connection that words couldn't fully capture. But then, I reminded myself of my place and stepped back. You should get some rest. Your leg needs care, I reminded him. Yes, ma'am, he replied with a playful tone. Have a good evening, Ms. Rachel. You too, Jack. He turned and walked back to his house, his steps slow but steady, his figure radiating quiet strength. I stood there for a while, watching him disappear from sight, my heart swirling with emotions I couldn't quite define. As I stepped back into my home, I realized that Jack's presence had brought a small yet undeniable joy to my days. But along with that joy came confusion and a deep questioning of the emotions that had begun to grow. I told myself I needed to be careful, yet my heart seemed unwilling to heed my mind. That night, the house was silent. Eric was away on a business trip, and Dylan was sound asleep in his room. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the steaming bowl of chicken soup I had just made, debating whether I should bring it over to Jack's house. He lived alone, his injury still healing, and I couldn't shake the thought of whether he was eating properly. But was visiting this late at night appropriate? I asked myself, but in the end, I picked up the bowl. It's just neighborly concern, nothing more, I reassured myself. Standing in front of Jack's door, I took a deep breath before knocking. His footsteps approached slowly, as if he was cautiously wondering who could be there. When the door opened, Jack stood holding an old book, dressed in a thick sweater and pajama pants. He looked surprised to see me, but quickly smiled. Rachel? It's late, what brings you here? I held up the bowl of soup. I just thought, maybe you haven't eaten yet. I made some chicken soup, it's warm and easy to digest. I hope you don't mind. Jack glanced at the soup, then back at me, his eyes betraying a touch of emotion. Thank you, Rachel. Really, thank you. Please, come in, it's too cold to be standing outside. I stepped inside. The house was still as cluttered as always, but he seemed to have made an effort to tidy up a bit, likely because of my previous visits. The coffee table was cleaner, the sofa slightly more organized, though a corner of the room still held a chaotic pile of old books. Take a seat, I'll set this down here, I said, moving to the table and placing the bowl of soup on it. The warm light of the lamp cast a cozy glow over the small dining table, creating an unexpectedly serene atmosphere. Jack sat down, his eyes never leaving me. Rachel, he said, his voice low but earnest, I honestly don't know how to thank you. You've not only helped me, but you've also made me feel like I'm not entirely alone. His words made me pause. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply smiled, trying to keep the mood light. There's no need to thank me. I just didn't want you skipping meals. Jack took a sip of the soup, then looked at me again, his gaze gentle yet filled with deep gratitude. Rachel, you're not just a kind neighbor. Eric and Dylan are incredibly lucky to have you in their lives. I chuckled, trying to brush off the strange feelings stirring within me. You're exaggerating. I'm just an ordinary woman, nothing special. No, Jack said softly, shaking his head. You have no idea how special you are. You remind me that there are still good things, that there are still people who care, even when they don't have to. I looked at him, unsure of what to say. His words, the sincerity in his eyes, left me momentarily speechless. I simply nodded, hiding the swell of emotion rising inside me. After a while, as a slight awkward silence crept in, I stood up. I should go. Dylan will wake up if he doesn't see me. Jack nodded, offering a faint smile. Thank you, Rachel. Truly, thank you. I nodded in return and stepped out the door, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Back in my own home, I realized his smile still lingered in my mind. It was as if I had playfully teased a flustered boy unsure of what to do, yet I was the one unable to shake off this peculiar feeling. I turned, ready to leave, when I felt a gentle hold on my wrist that made me freeze. Jack stood there, his eyes deep and lost. Rachel, his voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, yet brimming with raw emotion. I don't know how to thank you. You've been here, helping me through the darkest time of my life. Without you, I don't know what I would have done. I stood still, his hand warm but trembling as it grasped mine. My heart pounded, as though caught in this moment without any way to escape. I tried to steady myself, taking a deep breath. Jack, I began, my voice hesitant. You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone would do. Not everyone would, Jack replied, his gaze piercing as if it could see through my soul. You gave me hope, Rachel. Something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. His words sent a ripple through me. I wanted to pull my hand away, to break the tension suffocating the room, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The warmth of his hand left me flustered, yet reluctant to leave. Jack, I think you're just feeling overwhelmed, I said with an uneasy laugh, trying to lighten the atmosphere, as much to reassure myself as to ease him. You should get more rest. Your health is what matters most. Jack looked at me for a long moment before seeming to notice my discomfort. He let go of my hand, his shoulders sagging slightly. You're right. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he said softly, his tone heavy with regret. I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. It's all right, Jack. You don't need to apologize. I understand. In that moment, we stood facing each other in silence. The soft yellow glow from the living room lamp illuminated his face, revealing both weariness and a torrent of unspoken feelings. I didn't know what else to say, so I simply nodded and turned to leave. I'll head home now. Take care of yourself, Jack, I said quickly, eager to end this uneasy encounter. Rachel, he called after me, but stopped. Thank you. Truly, thank you, he said, his voice warm but tinged with something unfinished. As I stepped outside, the cold wind hit my face, but my heart was a whirlwind of turmoil. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, about the way his hand had held mine, not with possession, but as a silent plea for help. Have I gone too far? I asked myself as I walked across the thick layer of snow underfoot. Was it empathy for a lonely man, or was it something else, something I dared not name? I didn't have an answer, but my heart felt weighed down by unfamiliar emotions, like a crossroads where right and wrong blurred together, vague, tangled, yet impossible to break free from. In the days following that conversation, I tried my best to avoid Jack. Every time I saw him through the window or caught him watching me from afar, waves of strange emotions stirred within me. I reminded myself that he was just a neighbor, a man grappling with past wounds and rebuilding his life. And most importantly, I was a wife, a mother. I couldn't allow myself to slide down a dangerous path. Yet, my resolve only existed in my mind. Deep inside, I couldn't deny that Jack's presence had brought a fresh feeling into my life, something missing in Eric's busyness or the monotony of my routine. Sometimes, I wondered if it was merely sympathy for his loneliness, or if it was something deeper. That morning, Eric had left early, Dylan was at school, and I busied myself with chores, trying to push those ambiguous thoughts out of my head. But the more I tried, the more restless I became. Images of Jack's gaze and the way he expressed his gratitude replayed in my mind, refusing to fade. I glanced at the tray of freshly baked cookies and a thought sparked, why not take some to Jack? Isn't that what neighbors do? But I knew better than anyone that it wasn't just about being neighborly. I tried convincing myself it was merely a kind gesture, yet deep down, I understood I was looking for an excuse to see him, to feel his presence again. I hesitated, standing up and sitting back down multiple times, wrestling with my conscience. Finally, as if compelled by some unseen force, I packed a small batch of cookies, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The cold morning wind sent a shiver through me, but it wasn't enough to stop my steps. As I approached Jack's door, I reassured myself this was harmless. But with each step closer, the knot of emotions inside me tightened. Am I doing the right thing? Or is this the beginning of something I can't control? When I reached Jack's door, cookies still warm in my hand, I suddenly froze. My heart raced, not just from the quiet around me but from the turmoil within. What am I doing? I asked myself, staring at the old wooden door. But before I could turn to leave, the door opened. Jack stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and warmth. "Rachel," he said, his voice husky as though he had just woken up. "You came at the perfect time. I was just about to make coffee, and now I can offer you a cup." I gave a shy smile, lifting the bag of cookies as an explanation. "I just thought, you might like some cookies. I hope you don't mind." Jack smiled and stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "You're too thoughtful. Come in, it's too cold to stand out here." I stepped inside, immediately feeling the warmth of his small house. The space was noticeably tidier than before, though traces of his usual clutter remained, an open book on the sofa, a stack of newspapers haphazardly piled on the table. Jack quickly cleared a corner of the table, making room for the cookies. "The place looks much better," I remarked, trying to keep my tone light. Jack chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck with a touch of awkwardness. "I thought I should try, especially knowing you might drop by." I smiled softly but didn't know how to respond. He returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting a small chair opposite him for me. The steam rising from the cups filled the air, chasing away the morning chill. "Thank you, really," Jack said, his voice tender and filled with appreciation. "You're always thinking of me. It means more than you know." I looked down, feeling the warmth spread across my face. "It's just a small thing," I murmured, trying to hide my embarrassment. "I thought, maybe you could use a little sweetness in your life." Jack laughed, his deep, genuine chuckle breaking the tension. "Rachel, you've brought me more than just cookies, you know." His words made me look up, and I met his gaze, filled with emotion. I didn't know how to respond, my heart felt tangled in a swirl of feelings I couldn't name. A quiet moment passed between us, not uncomfortable, but one that seemed to hold more meaning than either of us dared to acknowledge. "I don't want to intrude too long," I said, finally breaking the silence. "I should head back before it gets dark." "Of course," Jack nodded, though his eyes seemed to linger, as if wishing I'd stay. "Thank you, Rachel. Truly." I stood, feeling both lighter and more conflicted. As I walked toward the door, I turned back with a smile. "Take care of yourself, Jack." He stood there, coffee in hand, watching me leave. As the door closed behind me, it didn't feel like a separation, but rather as though something had been left open, an invisible thread, waiting to be pulled. As I stood up to leave, my foot accidentally caught the edge of the small rug in the living room. Everything happened too quickly, I lost my balance and stumbled forward. Jack, reacting instinctively, reached out to catch me. But instead of steadying me, we both lost balance, and I tumbled straight into him. In that moment, I found myself lying on top of Jack, our faces so close that our breaths mingled in an almost suffocating intimacy. My lips brushed lightly against his, a brief, unintentional, yet undeniably electrifying contact. Time seemed to freeze. I could feel Jack's heartbeat pounding, mirroring the chaos within me. "Rachel," Jack whispered, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief, as though struggling to process what had just happened. I scrambled to push myself up, my face burning with embarrassment. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to," I stammered, unable to meet his gaze. Jack rose to his feet as well, adjusting his shirt, but his eyes remained fixed on me. No, I'm the one who should apologize. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. We stood facing each other, the silence between us thick and heavy, broken only by the faint sound of wind whistling through the window cracks. It felt as if the entire world had paused, leaving just the two of us suspended in this moment of awkward tension. Rachel, Jack finally spoke, his voice low and sincere. I don't know how to explain this, but since meeting you, I feel like I've come alive again, like someone truly cares about me. And maybe I've been thinking about that more than I should. I looked at him, his eyes deep and full of emotion, drawing me into a space I wasn't sure I could escape. His words made my heart ache, partly with guilt, partly with the undeniable truth in them. Jack, I began, but the words caught in my throat. All I could think about was the dangerous proximity between us, both literal and figurative. Jack took a deep breath and stepped back. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Please, go home, Rachel. I don't want to make things harder for you. I stood there, torn between reason and emotion. It's okay, Jack, I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. You should rest. I'll go now. As I turned and walked toward the door, my heart continued to race. Even as I stepped out into the yard, I couldn't stop myself from glancing back. Jack stood in the doorway, his gaze silently following me. I gave a small nod before hurrying back home, my mind swirling with a storm of conflicting emotions. In the darkness of the path leading home, I touched my lips, the spot where they had briefly met Jack's. My heart ached, not because of that accidental kiss, but because of everything it carried with it, a feeling I dared not name, and a fear that I had already lost control of what was happening. In the days following the incident, I tried my best to keep my distance from Jack. The mishap had made me realize I was teetering on a fragile line, where even the smallest misstep could bring everything crashing down. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that those feelings were nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness. I poured all my attention into Dylan, making an effort to be more present in his life. Every morning, I prepared breakfast with more care than usual, helped him with his homework, and spent more time talking with him. I also focused on Eric, trying to offer him the care and attention he often said I had neglected. I wanted to believe that by doing so, I could calm the storm of emotions within me. But no matter what I did, Jack's image continued to haunt me. His earnest eyes, his deep gaze, and the moment he caught me as I fell, it was all etched into my memory, impossible to erase. I avoided looking toward his house whenever I went outside. Yet, every so often, my eyes would involuntarily flicker toward the window across the street, where I knew he often stood. One afternoon, while trimming the roses in my yard, Jack stepped out of his house. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment, but I quickly turned away, pretending to be absorbed in the task at hand. I heard his voice call out a greeting, but I only nodded in response, keeping my focus on the plants as I tried to steady my nerves. Jack seemed to understand, remaining where he was for a moment before quietly retreating back inside. That evening, lying next to Eric, I found myself watching him intently. He was still the man I had once loved deeply, the one I had vowed to spend my life with. So why did I feel myself drifting away from him? I tried to convince myself that I still loved him, that our small family was all I needed. Yet, a part of me, one I refused to acknowledge, ached for a feeling I couldn't name. I told myself that time would bring everything back into balance. But deep down, I knew things had already shifted. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my distance from Jack. It was a bitterly cold winter night. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the streets, rooftops, and the bare trees in the yard. The dense layer of snow muffled every sound, leaving only the eerie whistle of the wind slipping through cracks in the windows, a chilling whisper of winter's grip. Eric had left early that morning and texted to say he wouldn't be able to return due to the roads being closed by the snowstorm. I stood in the kitchen, gazing out the window into the white expanse, feeling an unbearable emptiness inside. Dylan had long since fallen asleep, tucked under a warm quilt, while I was enveloped by a suffocating sense of loneliness. The house felt larger, colder, and devoid of any familial warmth. I poured myself a cup of hot tea, but its familiar aroma did nothing to soothe me. Glancing out the living room window, I noticed the light from Jack's house glowing warmly. The faint beams pierced through the thick snow, like a quiet invitation. A surge of longing rose within me, strong, insistent, and impossible to ignore. I threw on a heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and slipped into my tall winter boots. The icy wind bit at my face as soon as I opened the door, its sharpness like a blade against my skin. Each step across the snow-crusted ground produced a muffled crunch, the only sound in the otherwise still night. The sky was a deep black, and the light from Jack's house became my sole guide through the snowy abyss. Every step was fraught with hesitation, but something unseen pulled me forward. As I drew closer, the light from his window grew clearer, radiating a warmth my house seemed to lack. I stopped in front of his door, my breath forming wisps of vapor in the freezing air. My hand hovered over the wooden surface, trembling with indecision. Should I knock? Was my presence here a mistake? Before my rational mind could stop me, my hand moved on its own. I knocked softly, 3 gentle raps that echoed in the stillness, dissolving into the snowy void. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I was hoping to find on the other side of that door. I knocked softly, 3 quiet taps that quickly dissolved into the thick blanket of snow outside. For a fleeting moment, I thought about turning back. But before I could pull my hand away, the door opened. Jack stood there, his hair slightly tousled, wearing a thick sweater. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw me. "Rachel," he said, his voice warm and tinged with confusion. "It's freezing out here. What are you doing?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. My cheeks flushed red, whether from the biting cold or my embarrassment, I couldn't tell. I saw your lights on," I stammered. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Jack smiled, a curious but kind expression. "Come in," he said, stepping back to let me enter. The warmth of his home was a stark contrast to the icy chill outside. The golden glow from a lamp cast a cozy light over the room, making it feel smaller, more intimate. I stood there awkwardly, uncertain whether I should sit or leave, but Jack pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit. "Let me make you some tea," he said before I could refuse. I sat quietly, my hands resting on my lap, my emotions swirling. Before long, Jack returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea, setting one in front of me. "Thank you for stopping by," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Honestly, it's been a lonely evening." I smiled faintly, though my heart was racing. "I'm not sure why I came," I admitted. "Maybe it's just hard to be alone when everything outside feels so empty." Jack sat across from me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the wind howling outside the window and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then Jack broke the silence, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Rachel, I've thought a lot about what happened the other day, and what I said. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't deny how I feel." His words made my heart ache. "Jack," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know what to say. I care about you, but I have a family, and this." He nodded, his gaze dropping, sadness etched across his face. "I know. And I don't want to make you feel guilty. But I can't help wondering, if things were different, could we have?" His sentence hung in the air, unfinished, as though the weight of his thoughts couldn't be fully spoken. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I felt as though I were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't allow myself to fall into. "Jack," I whispered, my voice catching. "I can't." He gave a small, bittersweet smile. "I understand," he said, his eyes glistening with an indescribable sorrow. "I just want you to know, you've made my life better in ways I didn't think possible. Thank you for that." His words cut through me like a blade, gentle yet piercing. I didn't respond, only nodded slightly. Placing the tea down, I stood, my heart a storm of emotions. "You should get some rest," Jack said as he watched me walk to the door. "It's freezing outside." I stepped into the cold, the wind biting at my face, but the storm inside me was far stronger. As the door closed behind me, I knew this meeting had left an indelible mark. Was this the end, or just the beginning of something I couldn't control? As I reached the door, preparing to leave, Jack's voice stopped me. "Rachel, wait." I turned, and before I could react, he stepped closer, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation. "Just once," he said, his voice trembling. "If you regret it, I'll disappear from your life forever." I stood frozen, torn between duty and desire, between my love for my family and the intense, inexplicable feelings I couldn't deny. Jack held my gaze for a moment, then, as though knowing he couldn't ask more, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. It wasn't a kiss of possession or demand, but one of respect and quiet love. "Thank you for coming," he whispered, stepping back to create distance. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." I didn't respond, only nodded silently before turning and leaving. The snow continued to fall, but inside me, a tempest raged. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the nightlight casting soft shadows on the walls. Eric lay beside me, his breathing steady and calm, but my mind was anything but peaceful. Every moment from the encounter with Jack replayed in my mind like a looping film, the look in his eyes, his words, and that fleeting kiss. I turned to look at Eric. He was still the man I loved, the one I had built a life with, weathered storms with. So why, as I looked at him now, did my heart no longer flutter as it once had? Was it the monotony of daily life that had dulled the spark we once shared? And then there was Jack. His name echoed in my thoughts like a haunting melody. That kiss, or rather, that moment, felt like a sudden gust of wind reigniting an ember I thought had long been extinguished. What did it mean? Had I gone too far? I closed my eyes, willing myself to banish his image, to convince myself it was just a fleeting mistake, a moment of weakness. But my rational mind was no match for the storm of emotions raging inside me. In the still, cold silence of the winter night, I felt utterly lost between two worlds, one of duty and stability, the other of forbidden allure and unspoken desires. I reached out to touch Eric's hand, feeling the familiar warmth. Yet even that familiarity stirred an ache within me. Was I betraying him, simply by feeling this way? Or was I just a woman yearning to rediscover a part of herself she had long forgotten? The weight of unanswered questions pressed heavily on my chest. I felt as though I were standing at a crossroads, every path leading to consequences I wasn't ready to face. Where did my heart truly belong? I didn't know. But one thing was clear, after tonight, nothing in my life would ever be the same. In the first few days of not seeing Jack, I told myself he was probably busy. But as days turned into a week, the silence from the house next door grew increasingly unsettling. The lights remained off, the windows shut tight, and the empty yard only amplified my unease. I tried to reassure myself, perhaps he had gone to visit family or taken some time away. Yet, the more I tried to convince myself, the heavier the sense of dread became. I realized Jack's absence had left a void that wasn't merely about a neighbor. It felt more like the emptiness that comes when someone significant disappears from your life without warning. Every glance out the window was an involuntary search for him, but all I found was suffocating stillness. I couldn't focus on anything, and even Dylan noticed my restlessness. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, catching me staring blankly out the window. "Nothing, sweetheart," I replied, forcing a smile to hide the turmoil inside. Eric, too, noticed the change. "You've been acting strange lately. Is everything okay?" he asked one evening after coming home from work. I hesitated, deflecting with some trivial story. I couldn't tell him that my mind was preoccupied with our neighbor, that Jack's image haunted my thoughts. Eric looked at me with confusion but didn't press further. On the 8th day, just as my patience was wearing thin, the flashing blue lights of an ambulance stopped in front of Jack's house. My heart sank as I watched the paramedics wheel him out of the vehicle, his body covered in bandages, his face pale and etched with pain. I froze at my doorway, unable to believe what I was seeing. "Jack!" I exclaimed, running toward him. A paramedic stopped me, but Jack, despite his evident discomfort, gave a slight nod, signaling that I could approach. I helped them open the door and bring him inside. As we crossed the threshold, the air in his small home felt heavier than ever. The cozy space where we'd once shared warm conversations now seemed like the refuge of a broken man. "Rachel, thank you," he whispered, his voice weak but carrying the familiar warmth I knew so well. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I quietly cleared off the sofa so he could rest. A few moments later, he began explaining what had happened. On his way home from the bar where he worked, a reckless driver had struck him. He had suffered a broken leg, a fractured arm, and several other injuries, requiring emergency hospitalization. "The hospital bills were too much," he said with a faint, weary smile. "So I discharged myself early, even though I'm not fully healed." He mentioned planning to call his sister for help, but she lived far away and had young children of her own. "She can't do much," he added, his voice tinged with resignation. Hearing this, my heart clenched. "What are you going to do? Who's going to take care of you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jack shook his head slightly, his eyes vacant. "I don't know. I'll figure something out." In that moment, I knew I couldn't just walk away. He had no one to lean on, and leaving him to face this pain alone felt unimaginable. Taking a deep breath, I tried to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "If you don't mind," I said, keeping my tone calm, "I can help you for the next few days. At least until you find someone else to support you." Jack's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and gratitude flashing across his face. You don't have to do that, Rachel. I don't want to be a burden." "Don't say that," I replied with a small smile. "You've helped me plenty of times before. Let me return the favor." My words felt like a firm resolve, a commitment I wasn't entirely sure I could uphold, yet one I couldn't turn away from. As I set about making him comfortable, a part of me couldn't ignore the complexity of my feelings. Was this simply kindness, or was I trying to atone for the strange emotions that had quietly taken root in my heart? I didn't know where this decision would lead, but one thing was clear: I couldn't leave Jack to face his pain alone. Taking care of Jack was far from simple. He couldn't stand on his own, couldn't bathe himself, or manage basic personal tasks. I quickly realized that helping him required not only patience but also the courage to cross personal boundaries I hadn't anticipated. Every morning, after sending Dylan to school and Eric off to work, I would stop by Jack's house. Each time I entered, I found him seated in his old wheelchair, his face lighting up with gratitude. "Rachel, you don't have to do this," he would say whenever I brought food or supplies. But I'd just smile lightly, assuring him that it was the right thing to do. Bathing him was the most challenging part, for both of us. He couldn't move himself to the bathroom, and I felt awkward every time I had to assist. Initially, I tried to keep it simple, giving him a basin of warm water and a clean towel, but it became clear he couldn't manage alone. "Rachel, you don't have to. I'll figure it out," he stammered, his voice tinged with embarrassment as I brought him fresh towels and clothes. "Jack, you can't do this on your own," I replied softly but firmly. "Let me help you." I always turned my back while helping him undress, focusing only on cleaning his wounds and ensuring he was comfortable. Still, the occasional accidental brush of skin left us both flustered. Each time, I'd mutter a quick apology, and Jack would chuckle faintly, assuring me he understood. One day, as I bent down to pick up a fallen towel, his gaze accidentally met mine. "Rachel, you're the kindest person I've ever known," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't respond, focusing instead on helping him dress, though a surge of indescribable feelings welled up inside me. After about 2 weeks, the routine became familiar. I prepared meals for him, cleaned his house, and occasionally brought over dishes I had cooked so we could eat together. Despite the fatigue, I never complained or felt burdened. Perhaps it was the sincerity in Jack's eyes or the simple gratitude in his words that fueled my strength. Each day, Jack made small strides in recovery. His hands began to regain mobility, allowing him to hold a spoon or lift a cup. His leg, though still reliant on crutches, was slowly bearing more weight. Every tiny victory he achieved felt like my own, as though we were both overcoming challenges together. One afternoon, as I was tidying up his house, Jack called my name. I turned to see him in his wheelchair, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Rachel," he said, his voice trembling, "you have no idea how much this means to me. I don't have anyone, and yet you've stayed by my side." I set down the mop and walked closer. "Jack, don't say that. You've been through so much, and I'm just doing what I can." He shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Without you, I don't know where I'd be." His words made my throat tighten. In that moment, I didn't see myself as a caregiver, but as a companion, someone sharing his burdens and pain. Placing a hand gently on his shoulder, I said, "You don't owe me anything, Jack. I'm here because I want to be." Day by day, I felt closer to Jack, not because of the help I gave him, but because of the trust he placed in me. We didn't need to say much, but his eyes always conveyed gratitude and warmth I had never experienced elsewhere. Despite the busyness, I felt a lightness in my heart, as though I'd found a sense of purpose. And each time Jack smiled, I knew I had made the right choice to stay by his side during this difficult time. When I entered Jack's house one afternoon, an unfamiliar atmosphere immediately greeted me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a woman sitting in his living room, her demeanor as casual as if she owned the place. She was strikingly attractive, dressed in a form-fitting sweater that highlighted her perfect curves. Her golden hair was neatly tied back, exuding effortless elegance. Her sharp features and icy blue eyes were paired with a smirk that carried a hint of mockery. I froze in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Jack looked up, his expression shifting to one of surprise. "Rachel," he said, smiling, though there was a hint of discomfort in his eyes. The woman turned to me, standing with a confidence that filled the room. "Oh, so you're Rachel," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Jack's told me all about you. Thanks so much for taking care of him. But now that I'm here, you don't need to bother anymore." Her words felt like a knife slicing through me. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. My eyes darted to Jack, hoping he would say something to ease the tension. But he only looked at me with visible guilt before glancing at the woman. "Stop it, Karen," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "Rachel's done so much for me. If it weren't for her, I don't know what I would have done. Don't talk to her like that." I forced a strained smile, feeling completely out of place. "It's fine," I said softly. "I just came by to drop some things off." Placing the bag of clothes on the table, I steadied my voice. "I hope this will be helpful. I'll get going now." Before leaving, I glanced back at Jack. He sat with his head bowed, seemingly grappling with unspoken thoughts. Karen stood with her arms crossed, her expression smug and challenging. Closing the door quietly behind me, I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest. As I walked home, the cold air stung my skin, but it couldn't numb the ache inside me. I stood outside Jack's door, unwilling to leave just yet. My heart was in turmoil as I overheard the voices inside. Jack's voice rang out, sharp and filled with anger. "Karen, where were you when I couldn't walk? When I needed someone to take care of me, you disappeared. And now you come back, acting like you have some claim here?" Her voice followed, cold but tinged with discomfort. "I have my reasons. But Jack, this was my home too. I have every right to be here." "Your home?" Jack laughed bitterly. "This was my mother's house, left to me. You only want to come back now that I'm getting back on my feet." If it weren't for Rachel, I wouldn't even be here to face you." Hearing those words, I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to walk in, to defend Jack from Karen's cutting remarks. But reason held me back. This wasn't my place. Biting my lip, I fought back the emotions surging inside me and quietly walked away. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, my thoughts in chaos. The image of Karen sitting confidently in Jack's living room haunted me, along with Jack's conflicted expression. She's his ex-wife. They once loved each other. So what am I? Just a helpful neighbor or someone who's overstepped? I stared out the window at Jack's house, its lights still glowing warmly. A wave of emptiness washed over me. What am I hoping for? An explanation? Gratitude? Or something more than I should even dare to want? I told myself not to overthink it, but Jack's image, his eyes, his smile, his voice, lingered in my mind. I couldn't deny that Jack had become a part of my life, a part one wasn't sure I could, or should, let go of. An unnamed conflict. A few days later, as I walked past Jack's house, I saw him on his wheelchair, with Karen pushing him out onto the porch. She wore a vibrant red coat, her golden hair gleaming under the sunlight. They looked like a picture-perfect pair, Jack smiling up at her as she carefully wrapped a scarf around his neck. The sight made me freeze, my heart skipping a beat. Jack caught my eye and offered a polite, "Hello, Rachel," his tone gentle but distant. Karen turned toward me too, a faint smile playing on her lips, but her eyes carried a sharpness that felt almost challenging. "I told you, Rachel," she said, her voice warm but with a hint of triumph. "I'm taking care of Jack now. You don't need to worry anymore." I forced a polite smile, not trusting myself to say anything, and walked away quickly. Each step felt heavier, as if some unseen weight pressed on my chest. What is this I'm feeling? Relief? Or resentment? When I got home, I set the shopping bag down on the table and leaned against a chair, trying to steady my breathing. But the image of Jack and Karen together replayed in my mind, refusing to fade. I should be happy, shouldn't I? He's being cared for, and that's all I ever wanted. Yet the joy I expected never came. Instead, a hollow, frustrated ache lingered in its place. I gazed out the window, my eyes unconsciously drifting toward Jack's house. The warm glow of his light still shone as always, but now it felt distant, like a space I no longer belonged to. Maybe I've grown too used to being needed. And now that he has someone else, I feel displaced. Sitting down, I buried my face in my hands, my thoughts a tangled mess. Karen, why is she really back? Is it for him? Or for the house, as Jack said? I didn't know the answer, but the question wouldn't leave me alone. Why do I even care this much? The invisible distance. The next day, while trimming the bushes in my front yard, I saw Karen pushing Jack's wheelchair down the narrow path in front of my house. They were talking, both smiling, but Jack's smile didn't seem entirely genuine. As they passed, he turned his head briefly, glancing toward my house. His gaze carried an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Rachel," he called softly, his tone casual yet tinged with something unspoken, perhaps regret. I looked up, forcing a polite smile, and replied with a quiet nod. "Hello, Jack," I said evenly. Karen said nothing, casting me a look that was hard to read before continuing to push Jack down the path. When they disappeared from view, I retreated indoors, my emotions in turmoil. Why do I care so much about him? Have I misunderstood the nature of our relationship? Or worse, have I crossed a line? I had no answers. But one thing was certain, Karen's presence had altered everything, and I couldn't ignore how that made me feel. That afternoon, as Jack awoke from a nap, he opened up to me about Karen. He explained the real reason for her sudden return, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. "She's not here for me," I thought to myself. "She came back for the house." Jack's words were laced with bitterness as he recounted Karen's behavior. She only showed up when she thought she could take advantage of my situation, he said, his voice filled with quiet frustration. I looked at him, his frail figure slumped in the chair, his eyes clouded with weariness. Jack, I'm so sorry for what you've been through, I said softly, my voice full of sympathy. Yet deep down, I knew I was trying to reassure myself as much as him. Karen had no intention of staying by his side. She had come only to demand, to exploit his vulnerability for her own gain. Jack let out a bitter laugh, his gaze distant. Rachel, you don't have to apologize for her. I've always known who Karen is. I just didn't think she'd stoop this low, even now. He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. Despite the fatigue etched on his face, there was a hint of relief, as though he had finally let go of something he'd been holding on to for too long. I sat there in silence, watching Jack. The tension in my chest slowly unraveled, replaced by an inexplicable sense of calm. I've been overthinking, worrying about things that don't matter, I told myself. Karen's presence had once made me anxious, but her departure had brought clarity. Jack wasn't perfect, but he wasn't deceitful either. And I wasn't a replacement for a broken relationship, I was just someone who cared. Thank you for helping me clean up, Rachel, Jack said, his voice gentle but tinged with lingering guilt. I don't know how I would have managed without you. I smiled back, a light, genuine smile. Don't overthink it, Jack. You've been through enough. Focus on getting better, and if you need anything, just call me. Jack nodded, his eyes softer now, no longer clouded by despair. Rachel, you really are someone special, he said with quiet conviction. This time, his words didn't make me feel awkward or uncertain. Instead, I felt a sense of peace, as if we'd both reached an unspoken understanding after everything we'd been through. When I returned home, I paused at the door and took a deep breath. The crisp winter air felt refreshing, as though it were cleansing me of the emotional turmoil I'd carried for weeks. I realized that I had been trapping myself in a whirlwind of unnecessary feelings. Karen's presence had once unsettled me, but now I understood that my connection with Jack wasn't about her. It was about mutual understanding and genuine compassion. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table with Dylan, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Eric texted to say his work was going well and that he'd try to come home as soon as possible. I smiled as I replied, assuring him that everything at home was fine. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a balance between my responsibilities and my emotions. And in that moment, I knew I'd taken an important step toward regaining control over my heart and my life. As time passed, though Jack began to recover, the bond between us didn't fade, it only seemed to grow more complicated. Every time I saw him, my emotions churned as though a part of me resisted letting go of this man. Yet every time I returned home to Eric and Dylan, I was consumed by guilt. My mind was torn between logic and emotion, responsibility and desire. That morning, when I brought breakfast to Jack's house, he surprised me by opening the door himself. His unsteady steps tugged at my heart, but it was his eyes, soft, searching, and tender, that truly caught my attention. Rachel, you don't have to bring food anymore, he said, a smile on his face, but his voice betrayed a tremor. I'm fine now. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. It's become a habit, I replied lightly. I thought you'd be used to these breakfasts by now. But Jack's gaze didn't waver. You've done so much for me, he said, his voice dipping lower. And I don't want you to feel burdened anymore. Jack, I interrupted, placing the plate on the table. Don't think that way. I just want to help. Didn't you say you felt better because of me? He fell silent, his eyes carrying an unspoken weight I wasn't ready to face. The air between us thickened with tension. I quickly stood up, pretending to busy myself with cleaning the kitchen counter to avoid his gaze. But Jack stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Rachel, he said softly, his voice both tender and serious. I don't know how to put this into words, but I feel like I'd lose something very precious if you weren't here anymore. I froze, unable to meet his eyes. It felt as though the entire room had stopped moving. I knew I needed to say something, to draw a clear boundary, but the words wouldn't come. All I could hear was the relentless pounding of my heart. Jack. I don't know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I shouldn't be here. He withdrew his hand, but his gaze stayed fixed on me. I'm sorry, Rachel. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. But you need to know, you've become an important part of my life. On my way home, Jack's words replayed in my mind. His sincerity, his tender but yearning expression, left me unsettled. I couldn't tell if these feelings were simply empathy or if they had crossed into something far more dangerous. Guilt gnawed at me, especially when I thought of Eric. That evening, as I lay beside Eric, I watched him sleep, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. I thought about the early days of our relationship, our passionate dates as college students, the excitement of falling in love. But now, everything felt different. I couldn't deny that I still loved Eric, but that love had faded over the years, worn down by the weight of daily life and responsibilities. And then there was Jack. He was like a breath of fresh air, offering a sense of understanding and appreciation that I hadn't felt in so long. But I couldn't allow myself to dwell on those feelings. Rachel, what are you doing? I scolded myself. This is your family. This is Eric, this is Dylan. You can't destroy everything for another man. Eric recovered faster than I expected. Though his injuries required rest, he maintained his usual optimism and cheerfulness. The doctor assured us that with 2 weeks of recovery, he'd be fully healed. I thanked God for sparing him and keeping our family intact. I couldn't imagine life without him. As I watched Eric lying in bed, smiling reassuringly at me, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. My heart had never stopped loving him. After all these years, that love hadn't disappeared, it had only been obscured by exhaustion and the monotony of daily life. Now, more than ever, I was certain Eric was the only man I wanted to spend my life with. During Eric's recovery at home, I deliberately visited Jack less often. I needed to set boundaries, for myself and for him. I knew Jack understood, and that made me feel even guiltier. His gentle yet sorrowful gaze every time we met weighed heavily on my heart. One morning, when I stopped by Jack's house to check on him, he surprised me with an unexpected announcement. Rachel, I've decided to sell this house, he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. This place holds so many memories of my childhood, but I think it's time for me to move on. I need to start over. I looked at him, my feelings a tangled mix of sadness and understanding. I knew this was the right choice for him, but a part of me still felt an inexplicable sense of loss. Jack, that's a brave decision, I said, my voice trembling slightly. You deserve a fresh start, a new beginning. I believe you can do it. Jack smiled faintly, his expression resolute yet tinged with bittersweet nostalgia. Rachel, you and Eric are perfect together. I'm happy you've realized that. As for me, I need to leave so no one feels tied down. His words left me silent, my throat tightening with emotion. I felt gratitude for his selflessness, but also an overwhelming heaviness. Jack's choice to let go and rebuild his life was something I deeply respected, even if it left an emptiness behind. To bid Jack farewell, I decided to invite him over for dinner with my family. Eric, still recovering, was fully supportive of the idea, and Dylan was excited when he heard that Jack would join us. That evening, I prepared a cozy dinner, featuring dishes I knew Jack enjoyed. When he arrived, he brought a bottle of red wine. I thought we should toast to new beginnings, Jack said, his eyes sparkling with hope for the future. The three of us sat around the table, the atmosphere warm and tinged with nostalgia. Jack shared his plans, selling the house, moving somewhere new, and starting fresh. Eric, still on the mend, listened attentively and offered words of encouragement. Jack, you're a strong man, Eric said, raising his glass. I have no doubt you'll succeed. Here's to your new journey. I raised my glass as well, smiling warmly at Jack. Wishing you all the best. Thank you for being here during tough times. We'll always remember you. Jack looked at both of us, his gaze tender and genuine. Thank you, Rachel, Eric. You two are incredibly lucky to have each other. I hope your happiness lasts forever. The three of us clinked glasses, the sound resonating in the cozy room. That night, my heart was filled with peace and relief. I knew I had made the right choice, for Eric, for Jack, and for myself. On the day Jack left, I stood by the window, watching him one last time as he closed the door to his house. Dylan ran to wave goodbye enthusiastically, and Eric nodded with a warm smile. I didn't know where Jack's journey would take him, but I believed he would find the happiness he deserved. As for me, I had returned to my family, to the man I loved and the son who completed our world. Life wasn't perfect, but it was where I belonged. And that, I realized, was more than enough.